In the early 14th century, Scotland was not a free country. Much of it was under English control, and its future was being decided by force rather than law. The Battle of Bannockburn would change that, but only because everything had already gone wrong before a sword was raised. Robert the Bruce had declared himself king in 1306, but his claim was fragile. He had enemies at home, rivals among the nobility, and the full power of England against him. To Edward II, King of England, Bruce was not a monarch. He was a rebel who needed to be crushed. Stirling Castle became the focal point. It controlled movement between the north and south of Scotland, and its loss would be a humiliation England could not accept. When the castle's commander agreed to surrender, if not relieved by midsummer 1314, Edward had no choice. He had to march north. This was not just about territory. If Bruce lost here, his kingship would likely collapse. If Edward won, Scottish resistance might finally break. Bannockburn was not chosen by accident. It was chosen because it forced the English army to fight where numbers and cavalry counted for less. Before the battle began, Bruce had already shaped the outcome. Before the battle itself, everything depended on the English army and the man leading it. Because Bannockburn was not lost by lack of strength, but by how that strength was handled. Edward II marched north in 1314 with one of the largest forces ever assembled in Britain, confident that sheer numbers would decide the outcome. And on paper, the English advantage was overwhelming. With thousands of infantry, hundreds of armored knights, and the wealth of a powerful kingdom behind them. But size alone did not guarantee control. Edward was not the commander his father had been, and his authority over his nobles was weak, with many knights loyal more to their own status than to any coordinated plan. And this lack of unity mattered long before fighting began. The army itself was slow and unwieldy, stretched across roads and tracks not designed for such numbers. Supplies lagged behind. Discipline varied from unit to unit, and by the time they reached the Bannockburn, many soldiers were already tired and frustrated. More importantly, the English command believed the Scots would avoid battle, as they had done in the past, retreating into the countryside and refusing to stand their ground. And this assumption shaped every decision Edward made. There was little concern for terrain, little patience for careful deployment, and almost no expectation that the Scots would fight in a disciplined, organized way. When reports came back that Robert the Bruce had formed his army and was waiting, the reaction was not caution but disbelief, because from the English perspective, this was not bravery but arrogance, and arrogance deserved punishment. Knights were eager to prove themselves, confident that a single charge would scatter the Scottish infantry, and Edward allowed this confidence to drive events rather than restrain it. Bannockburn would expose the weakness of that mindset, because an army built on power and expectation can unravel quickly when reality refuses to match belief, and by the time the English reached the battlefield, their greatest advantage had already begun to work against them. The Scottish army that gathered near Bannockburn looked nothing like the force Edward expected to face, because it was smaller, poorer, and almost entirely infantry. Yet this was not a weakness but a deliberate choice shaped by experience and necessity. Robert the Bruce understood that Scotland could not match England in cavalry, armor, or wealth, so instead he focused on discipline, cohesion, and terrain, turning limitations into structure. The core of the Scottish force was the schiltron, a dense formation of spearmen trained to move and fight together, presenting a solid front that could not easily be broken by horses. And unlike earlier Scottish armies that had used these formations defensively and remained static, Bruce trained his men to advance slowly while maintaining formation, a crucial adaptation that would change the course of the battle. This required relentless drilling and trust, because a single man breaking ranks could open a fatal gap. And yet the Scots held, bound by shared purpose and familiarity with one another, rather than feudal obligation. Many of these men were not professional soldiers, but farmers and townsmen, fighting not for pay or plunder, but for survival and autonomy, which gave the army a different character from the English host. Morale among the Scots was high, not because they believed victory was guaranteed, but because they believed the plan gave them a chance, And in warfare, belief often matters as much as numbers. Bruce also chose the ground with care, positioning his army where marshy soil, woodland, and narrow approaches restricted movement and denied the English cavalry the space needed to charge effectively, meaning that even before contact was made, the English advantages were being quietly stripped away. This was not a gamble made in desperation, but a calculated decision born of earlier failures, and Bruce knew that if the Scots stood firm and refused to be drawn into open ground, the battle would unfold on his terms. By the time the English arrived, the Scottish army was already in place, organized, prepared, and waiting, and although smaller in number, it was unified in purpose, disciplined in movement, hand-shaped by a commander who understood that the battle would be decided not by strength alone, but by how carefully that strength was forced to fight. Before the main battle was fought, the night itself played a role in shaping what followed. Because Bannockburn was decided as much by exhaustion, confusion, and misjudgment as by weapons, the English army arrived late in the day, stretched out and disorganized after a long march, with units arriving at different times and camps forming wherever space allowed, leaving little opportunity for careful planning or rest. Morale remained confident, but confidence masked fatigue, and many soldiers slept poorly on unfamiliar ground, surrounded by marshland and woodland that restricted movement even in daylight. By contrast, the Scottish army was already positioned, settled and waiting, familiar with the terrain and prepared for what the morning would bring. Robert the Bruce understood that battles were often decided before fighting began, and he used the night to reinforce discipline, ensure formations were ready, and steady his men for what lay ahead. While English commanders debated and knights boasted of what they would achieve at dawn, the Scots focused on holding formation and resisting the urge to engage too early. This contrast mattered because uncertainty and impatience grow in darkness, especially within large armies where command is divided and rumors travel faster than orders. Throughout the night, English scouts struggled to read the ground ahead, misjudging distances and underestimating how constrained the battlefield truly was, while Scottish positions remained deliberately quiet and controlled, revealing little. As dawn approached, the English army faced a choice it barely recognized as a choice at all: whether to slow down, reassess, and deploy carefully, or to press forward and force a decisive engagement. Confidence and expectation pushed them toward action, while caution was sidelined. The Scots, by contrast, had already committed to their plan, knowing that time favored preparation rather than movement. When morning came, both armies rose from the night shaped by very different experiences. One restless and overconfident, the other focused and ready, and the imbalance created in those dark hours would carry forward into the first clashes of the battle itself. The first fighting at Bannockburn did not begin as a grand clash of armies, but as a series of encounters driven by impatience and misjudgment. On the morning of the 23rd of June, English forces advanced expecting the Scots to withdraw, yet instead they found them holding firm on ground that offered little room to maneuver, and this alone should have given pause. Among the English knights, confidence quickly turned into irritation, because standing still felt like weakness, and waiting felt unnecessary when superiority seemed obvious. Small groups pushed forward, probing Scottish positions without a coordinated plan, and it was during one of these early movements that the tone of the battle was set. A mounted English knight rode ahead, seeking to test the Scottish line, and Robert the Bruce himself moved forward to meet him, armed only with a spear. In a brief, brutal exchange, Bruce struck the knight down, splitting his helmet and killing him instantly, a moment that carried enormous symbolic weight. It showed the Scots that their king would stand with them, and it showed the English that this would not be an easy victory. Beyond that encounter, fighting remained limited but revealing, as English cavalry struggled to operate effectively on the confined ground, finding their movements restricted by marsh and woodland, while Scottish formations held together, refusing to break or pursue recklessly. Skirmishes flared and died away, leaving casualties on both sides but no decisive result. And by the end of the day it was clear that English expectations had not been met. The Scots had not retreated, had not panicked, and had not exposed themselves to the kind of charge the English relied upon. Instead, they had absorbed pressure and remained in control of their positions. For Edward and his commanders, this was an uncomfortable outcome, because it meant the following day would not be a simple matter of force, but a battle fought on terms they did not fully control. As evening fell, both armies withdrew slightly to rest, but the psychological balance had shifted. With Scottish confidence rising and English certainty beginning to erode, setting the stage for the far more decisive fighting that would follow with the coming dawn. The decisive phase of Bannockburn began not with a single order, but with pressure building until control slipped away. On the morning of the 24th of June, the English army advanced in force, determined to bring the battle to a conclusion. Yet almost immediately, the limits of the ground began to assert themselves. The narrow approaches, marshy soil, and woodland compressed thousands of men into spaces never meant to hold them. And the English cavalry, so effective on open fields, found itself crowded, slowed, and unable to maneuver freely. Knights pushed forward in dense formations, but without the speed or space required to break the Scottish lines, and as they stalled, men behind them continued to press forward, creating congestion rather than momentum. The Scottish schiltrons advanced steadily, maintaining formation and denying the English any opportunity to regroup, their discipline turning movement itself into a weapon. As pressure mounted, English infantry were forced into the fighting piecemeal, entering the battle without coordination and finding themselves trapped between cavalry struggling to withdraw and Scottish spearmen refusing to yield ground. Attempts to bring archers forward were hampered by the lack of space and by Scottish counter-moves that disrupted their positions. Before they could be effective, confusion spread as orders failed to travel through the mass of men, and local decisions replaced any coherent plan. What had been intended as a powerful advance began to slow, then buckle as exhaustion, fear, and frustration took hold. The Scots sensed the shift and continued to press, not through reckless pursuit, but through relentless cohesion, forcing the English further into the confined ground where escape routes narrowed and formations dissolved. By mid-morning, it was becoming clear that the English army was no longer dictating events, but reacting to them, and once that balance had tipped, recovery became increasingly unlikely. Bannockburn was not being won through sudden collapse, but through steady erosion, as an army built for dominance found itself constrained, crowded, and unable to fight as it had expected, while the smaller force before it continued to move forward with purpose and control. As the pressure continued to build, the English army reached a point where confusion turned into fear, and fear into panic, because Bannockburn was no longer unfolding according to expectation. Units that had advanced confidently now found themselves trapped with no clear path forward or back, squeezed between marshy ground, woodland, and the unyielding Scottish formations pushing steadily ahead. Orders could not be heard, banners were lost in the crush, and the sense of control that held the army together began to unravel. Men at the front could not advance, while those behind continued to press forward, unaware of the situation ahead, creating a dangerous surge that collapsed any remaining cohesion. As Scottish pressure increased, English soldiers began to fall back instinctively, not as part of an organized withdrawal, but as individuals seeking space to breathe and move. Once that instinct took hold, it spread rapidly, because retreat is contagious in battle, and panic travels faster than commands. Horses reared and turned, infantry were knocked aside, and men stumbled into marshland where armor became a burden rather than protection. Attempts to rally the troops failed as officers found themselves unable to reach their men, and even experienced knights struggled to impose order amid the noise, mud, and exhaustion. The Scots sensed the moment and continued their advance, not accelerating into reckless pursuit, but maintaining pressure that denied the English time to regroup or stabilize their lines. This steady movement proved devastating, because it turned withdrawal into flight and flight into collapse. Edward II remained nearby, but the situation was slipping beyond his control, and the realization that the army was breaking carried a psychological weight that no reserve force could now reverse. Bannockburn was entering its final phase, not through a dramatic turning blow, but through the gradual disintegration of an army that had lost confidence in its own ability to fight. And once that confidence was gone, defeat became inevitable. As the English army began to break apart, the battlefield turned from a place of resistance into a trap, because Bannockburn offered no clear escape once cohesion was lost. Men who attempted to withdraw found themselves moving into marshy ground where footing was poor and armor became deadly weight, while others were driven sideways into woodland or pressed toward the Bannockburn itself, where congestion grew worse with every step. What had begun as retreat quickly became flight, not because every soldier panicked at once, but because the structure that allowed them to act together had collapsed. Scottish pressure remained steady and controlled, advancing not in a wild surge, but as a unified front that denied the English time or space to recover. At this stage, numbers counted for very little, because the battlefield could no longer contain the army that had been sent into it, and thousands of men found themselves unable to fight, unable to flee, and unable to understand what was happening beyond the few meters in front of them. Casualties mounted rapidly, not through dramatic single blows but through exhaustion, trampling, and isolation. As individuals were cut off and overwhelmed, many English soldiers drowned in shallow water, dragged down by the weight of their armor as they struggled to escape the press of men behind them. The psychological impact of this phase was decisive, because once soldiers realized there was no organized withdrawal, fear replaced discipline entirely. Rumors spread that the rear had been cut off, that commanders were dead, that escape routes were closed, and in the noise and confusion, there was no way to confirm or deny any of it. The Scots continued forward, their formations holding even as the English disintegrated, turning pressure into inevitability. By this point, the battle was no longer being fought in any conventional sense, but was instead unraveling under its own weight, as an army built for dominance collapsed because it could not adapt to the ground, the conditions, or the resistance it faced. Bannockburn had passed the point of recovery, and what remained was the consequence of every earlier decision finally coming due. As the English army collapsed, attention turned inevitably to the fate of its king, because Edward II now faced a decision that no commander wishes to make. Remaining on the battlefield no longer offered the possibility of control or recovery, and staying risked capture or death, outcomes that would have catastrophic consequences for England. Surrounded by confusion and retreating troops, Edward was urged by his advisors and bodyguards to withdraw while escape was still possible. This was not a strategic retreat, but a necessity born of circumstance, because the battlefield was no longer governed by orders, only by momentum. As Scottish forces continued to press forward, the area around the English command became increasingly unstable, and the danger of being cut off grew with every moment. Edward was escorted from the field under guard, moving away from the fighting as discipline dissolved around him, his departure signaling to many that the battle was truly lost. In medieval warfare, the presence of a king carried immense symbolic weight, and once it became known, or even suspected, that Edward had fled, any remaining hope of resistance evaporated. Soldiers who might otherwise have attempted to regroup now focused solely on escape, and panic deepened as the army fractured further. Edward's flight was hurried and perilous, passing through territory still contested and relying on the loyalty and speed of a small escort rather than the protection of an army. He eventually reached safety, but the retreat itself underlined the scale of the defeat, because kings did not abandon victorious fields. For Robert the Bruce, Edward's withdrawal confirmed what had already become clear on the ground, that the English army was no longer capable of organized resistance, and that the battle had been won not only in physical terms but in psychological ones as well. The flight of the English king transformed Bannockburn from a hard-fought engagement into a decisive victory, because it removed any possibility of reversal and marked the complete failure of the campaign. What remained on the field was not an army preparing to fight another day, but a shattered force in full retreat, leaving behind banners, equipment, and the belief that English power alone could decide the fate of Scotland. Bannockburn did not end the war between Scotland and England, but it changed its direction permanently, because it proved something that had been uncertain until that moment, that Scotland could defend its independence by force against the full power of a much larger kingdom. The victory transformed Robert the Bruce from a contested claimant into a credible and respected king, both at home and abroad, and it strengthened loyalty among those who had previously doubted his cause. For many Scots, Bannockburn became more than a battle, becoming a symbol of survival, discipline, and the ability to resist domination through unity rather than numbers. In England, the defeat was a humiliation that damaged Edward II's authority and reputation, reinforcing existing doubts about his leadership and accelerating internal divisions that would later contribute to his downfall. Politically, Bannockburn shifted negotiations because English leaders could no longer assume that Scotland would eventually submit, and over time this reality led to recognition of Scottish independence in the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328. Militarily, the battle reshaped thinking across Britain and beyond, demonstrating that infantry, properly trained and deployed on suitable ground, could defeat heavy cavalry. Challenging long-held assumptions about medieval warfare, the lessons of Bannockburn were studied, repeated and adapted in later conflicts, influencing how battles were fought for generations. Yet for all its long-term consequences, the victory came at a cost because Scotland remained exhausted, its land scarred by years of conflict, and its people burdened by the demands of war, even after success had been secured. Bannockburn did not deliver peace overnight, but it delivered legitimacy, time and leverage, allowing Scotland to survive as a political entity rather than fade into conquest. Today, the battlefield itself is quiet, its contours softened by centuries of change, but the significance of what happened there endures, not because of legend or myth, but because it represents a moment when preparation, restraint, and understanding of circumstance overcame raw power. Bannockburn endures precisely because it was not inevitable, and because it reminds us that history often turns not on size or strength alone, but on decisions made long before the first blow is struck.